A new survey showing a majority of Canadians think that boycotting American-made goods or travel to the U.S. is helpful.
If all Canadian tourists boycott Burger King, could a simple act of consumer retaliation be powerful enough to shake an American fast food empire? That is the alarming hypothetical now being examined as political tensions rise between the United States and Canada, and millions of Canadian travelers reconsider where they spend their money when visiting America. For decades, Canada has been the single largest source of international visitors to the United States, generating more than 20 billion United States dollars in annual tourism spending. A meaningful share of that money flows directly into American fast food chains. And although Burger King operates more than 7,000 restaurants across the country, few Americans realize just how dependent certain locations are on Canadian tourism inflows. But in this hypothetical scenario, diplomatic friction, hostile border encounters, and a wave of nationalistic consumer sentiment in Canada ignite a movement urging travelers to avoid all American fast food brands. Burger King becomes the first symbolic target, and analysts warn that the impact could spread far beyond lost sales. If this boycott truly happened, how devastating would the impact be on the chain and on the economy of the United States? Stay until the end, because the real shock lies deeper than anyone expects. Tourism analysts warn that the United States has quietly built a vulnerability into its economic model. When a specific national group controls a significant share of spending in restaurants, airports, hotels, entertainment corridors, and transportation networks, any organized withdrawal of their purchasing power can hit with the force of a targeted economic strike. Even a symbolic boycott could amplify investor anxiety, trigger franchise instability, and push tourism-reliant regions toward financial volatility. And this scenario raises a far more unsettling question for Washington. If a boycott from one friendly nation can expose this much fragility, what would happen if multiple countries adopted the same strategy during a period of geopolitical tension or rising tariffs? The answer to that question is the turning point in this story, and it is far more explosive than the public realizes. The hypothetical boycott by Canadian tourists reveals a second layer of vulnerability deeply embedded within the operational structure of Burger King in the United States. The extreme sensitivity of franchise profitability to fluctuations in non-resident consumer demand. While many Americans assume that domestic customers form the entire backbone of fast food revenue, the financial data of tourism-dependent regions paints a very different picture. In certain states, non-resident travelers can account for double the average spending recorded in normal suburban locations, creating a fragile economic ecosystem where even small deviations influence the entire business chain. At the store level, individual franchisees operate on narrow financial margins and depend on predictable waves of seasonal demand. When those patterns are disrupted, the consequences arrive immediately. A significant decline in the number of Canadian visitors would reduce transaction volume, weaken operating cash flow, and force store managers to scale back labor hours. For many locations near airports, theme parks, interstate highways, and border crossings, the loss of this revenue stream could push units below their minimum profitability threshold. The operational shock does not end at the counter. It extends backward, striking the supply chain that sustains Burger King's network inside the United States. Food distributors schedule deliveries based on expected foot traffic, and reductions in shipment volume lead to lower manufacturing output for meat processors, bakery suppliers, packaging facilities, and condiment manufacturers. Logistics companies that transport goods across multiple states must reduce routes or consolidate shipments, diminishing working hours for drivers, warehouse staff, and contract laborers. This contraction ripples outward. A slowdown in the fast food supply network affects utility consumption, real estate leasing, commercial cleaning services, and secondary vendors that often depend on predictable contracts. In the aggregate, these effects can produce a measurable decline in regional employment levels, especially in states where the tourism sector interacts heavily with the food service industry. What appears on the surface to be a narrow boycott aimed at a single restaurant chain becomes, in practice, an economic disturbance striking hundreds of interconnected businesses. And yet, The deeper problem is not the loss itself, it is what the loss reveals about the structural exposure of United States commerce to shifts in Canadian consumer behavior. Beyond the franchise level, the hypothetical boycott by Canadian travelers strikes at the broader tourism economy of the United States, a sector that relies heavily on predictable cross-border movement. Canada has long been the largest source of foreign visitors entering the American market, and their spending influences hotels, casinos, entertainment venues, rental car companies, amusement parks, airport retail outlets, and local transportation networks. When a major traveler group alters its spending patterns, the effects reverberate through every layer of the regional economy. Local governments face immediate fiscal pressure. Tourism taxes, including hotel occupancy fees, airport concession revenue, and local sales taxes generated by food service, provide essential funding for infrastructure and public services. A noticeable decline in Canadian spending reduces municipal revenue, forcing cities that depend on tourism to consider budget cuts or new borrowing. In coastal states such as Florida and Hawaii, and entertainment hubs such as Nevada and California, the impact could be especially severe. At the same time, commercial property owners feel the strain. High traffic locations that attract international visitors rely on consistent footfall to justify elevated commercial rents. If Canadian travelers avoid American fast food chains entirely, foot traffic around these properties declines, pushing vacancy rates upward and weakening rental markets. This creates a secondary economic challenge for cities already facing pressures from rising operational costs and fluctuating post-pandemic tourism demand. Meanwhile, competing industries experience collateral damage. Retail outlets, rideshare drivers, tour operators, convenience stores, and entertainment businesses all benefit from the spillover effect created when tourists cluster around recognizable food service brands. If travelers bypass American chains, they may also reduce spending in adjacent spaces, compounding the financial losses across multiple sectors. These shifts gradually erode the stability of regional job markets, especially in communities built around tourism corridors. But the most significant implication is geopolitical. If a symbolic consumer action by travelers from Canada is capable of inflicting this scale of disruption, policymakers in Washington must confront an uncomfortable truth. The United States may be more vulnerable to targeted economic pressure from friendly nations than it has publicly acknowledged. And once that vulnerability is exposed, other countries could test it, especially during periods of trade war tension or negotiations over new tariffs. What happens if the hypothetical boycott becomes a blueprint for international economic influence? The answer could reshape how the United States understands its own security. From the perspective of Washington, the boycott by Canadian tourists is not merely a commercial disturbance. It is a strategic warning shot. It exposes an uncomfortable reality inside the United States economy. A foreign consumer group, even one from a friendly neighbor, has the capacity to exert targeted pressure on American industries without deploying diplomats, without invoking tariffs, and without entering any formal negotiation. This is a form of influence that bypasses government channels entirely, yet carries the power to destabilize a multinational corporation and disrupt multiple tourism-dependent states simultaneously. Economic analysts in the United States financial community are particularly concerned about the timing. Major American sectors are already under strain from global inflation, supply chain volatility, and the lingering economic aftershocks of the pandemic-era disruptions. The sudden withdrawal of spending by Canadian travelers forces a re-evaluation of several long-standing assumptions about economic resilience. The conventional belief that the United States can absorb external shocks due to its massive domestic market is no longer taken for granted. Under certain conditions, even a partial shift in cross-border consumer behavior can generate measurable instability. Political strategists in Washington are equally troubled. For years, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been described as one of the most stable bilateral partnerships in the world. Yet the events surrounding this boycott demonstrate that emotional, cultural, and political reactions can override decades of cooperation. The internal debate inside Washington now focuses on a critical question. If the United States can be pressured so easily by the actions of a close ally, what might adversarial nations attempt during future trade negotiations, especially during a period marked by global tension and renewed trade war risks. Another point of concern centers on the business environment. International investors have long viewed the American market as the safest destination for global capital. The boycott challenges that perception. Investors are suddenly weighing the possibility that American companies operating in politically sensitive industries are exposed to consumer retaliation from foreign populations. This is a new form of uncertainty that traditional economic models have not fully priced in. Policymakers must now confront a stark question. Should the federal government begin incorporating consumer-driven geopolitical actions into national economic planning? The implications are staggering. If the actions of travelers from Canada can destabilize a major fast food chain, then the United States may be underestimating its exposure to international economic leverage. And the more analysts study the situation, the more one conclusion becomes inescapable: the true risk extends far beyond a single company or a single industry. Outside the United States, governments and financial institutions are observing the boycott with intense interest. To many international actors, it demonstrates that global economic power is shifting in ways that are not yet reflected in traditional diplomacy. A coordinated action by citizens of a middle power country like Canada can meaningfully affect revenue flows, employment levels, supply chain operations, and investor confidence inside the world's largest economy. This is a revelation with profound implications. In Europe and Asia, economic planners are quietly discussing the long-term meaning of this development. If public sentiment can be mobilized to influence the internal economic stability of the United States, then consumer-driven strategies could become an increasingly common geopolitical tool. Unlike tariffs or sanctions, which require formal state action and often provoke direct retaliation, consumer mobilization is subtle, socially driven, and extremely difficult for any government to counteract. It operates beneath the surface of traditional diplomacy, yet its impact can be felt immediately on corporate balance sheets and stock market valuations. This shift raises new concerns for multinational corporations headquartered in the United States. Executives must now begin assessing political risk not only at the national level but at the emotional level of foreign populations. In a world where geopolitical tensions are rising, where supply chains are being redrawn, and where new trade war dynamics are reshaping global commerce, companies cannot assume the loyalty or neutrality of international consumers. The ground is shifting beneath their feet. Moreover, rival nations are studying the situation with strategic interest. If an ally such as Canada can apply economic pressure without government involvement, then what might a competitor attempt during a diplomatic dispute? Could consumer mobilization become a new form of soft power capable of influencing negotiations over energy exports, technology transfers, or security agreements? These questions are now circulating in think tanks across Europe and Asia. International markets are also signaling unease. Traders in major financial hubs have begun debating whether the risk premium for United States consumer-facing stocks should rise. The idea that internal American economic stability can be influenced by external consumer sentiment challenges, long-standing assumptions about global capital safety. And yet, the most consequential development may still lie ahead. A growing number of policymakers believe this boycott could mark the start of a new era where nations quietly weaponize consumer behavior as a counterweight to the traditional dominance of the United States. If this trend accelerates, the global balance of economic power may shift faster than anyone in Washington is prepared to acknowledge. The sustained withdrawal of Canadian tourist spending forces the United States to confront a structural threat that has been building for years: the growing ability of foreign consumers to influence internal American market dynamics. Unlike tariffs or formal sanctions, which generate immediate diplomatic responses, consumer-driven pressure is silent, decentralized, and politically unpredictable. It strikes directly at corporate revenue streams and regional employment, while offering Washington little room for a clear countermeasure. This development also signals a deeper shift. Nations observing the effects of this boycott may view it as proof that the United States can be pressured without entering a traditional trade war. A coordinated consumer action can weaken American corporate performance while avoiding the retaliatory spiral that tariffs usually trigger. The long-term worry in Washington is that other countries could adopt similar tactics during periods of diplomatic confrontation, targeting sectors more critical than fast food, including technology, energy, or aviation. For the United States economy, the arrival of this strategy introduces an entirely new category of vulnerability. Unlike conventional economic tools, the power of consumer sentiment is not constrained by treaties, political alliances, or geographic borders. It can be activated quickly, spread virally, and create disruptions that outpace the ability of policymakers to respond. The uncomfortable question is whether the United States has underestimated how exposed it is to this emerging form of influence. Despite the escalating risks, there are potential opportunities if Washington and the private sector respond decisively. For businesses such as Burger King, the pressure could force long overdue modernization, diversifying revenue sources beyond tourism-heavy regions, restructuring franchise assistance programs, and investing in corporate diplomacy to rebuild trust with Canadian consumers. This type of soft power engagement may eventually become a standard requirement for global brands headquartered in the United States. For policymakers, the boycott opens the door to a broader reassessment of cross-border economic ties. With Canada serving as the largest trading partner of the United States, repairing the political and cultural relationship may deliver benefits that extend far beyond tourism recovery. Improved dialogue could reduce trade tensions, stabilize negotiations over tariffs, and prevent the emergence of a new trade war environment in North America. Yet, even with these opportunities, one unresolved issue continues to overshadow every discussion: whether the United States can adapt quickly enough to prevent this form of consumer pressure from becoming a permanent geopolitical weapon. Because if this trend spreads beyond Canada, the next phase of global economic competition may unfold in a way the United States has never faced before. The cascading effects of the boycott have revealed far more than a dispute between travelers and a restaurant chain. They have exposed a shifting balance in the global economic order where public sentiment, cross-border mobility, and political narratives can reshape financial outcomes inside the United States with surprising speed. As Canada responds to tensions in its own way, Washington is left to confront a new era in which influence is no longer exercised only through tariffs, diplomacy, or the formal structure of a traditional trade war. It now emerges through the choices ordinary consumers make when crossing a border. What this moment ultimately represents is a test of resilience for American companies, a test of flexibility for policymakers, and a test of how the United States manages its closest alliances in a world where geopolitical pressure is evolving beyond familiar frameworks. Whether the country adapts or resists will determine how deep the impact becomes in the years ahead. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States? The answer may shape the next chapter of North American economic relations.